Hi there, I'm Shaun Bindley and this is Meet the Ministers. My guest on the program this evening is former Brisbane Lord Mayor and the leader of the LNP here in Queensland, Campbell Newman. Campbell, welcome.
Thanks, Shaun.
What made you choose a career in politics? I believe you have a fairly serious political background family-wise.
Well, I do have a background family-wise with mum and dad being involved in federal politics, but that actually should have put me off. I never really wanted to be involved in politics. It was more, I put my hand up some 9 years ago to actually sort of make a difference in Brisbane because I felt not enough was being done on the infrastructure needs of the city. So I sort of got into it in that way. It was about getting stuff done, yeah.
Brisbane's gone through some pretty amazing transitional changes. The population has increased rapidly. It's been I guess a process of catching up over the last 10, 20 years for Brisbane. We've seen an amazing rise in infrastructure. What was the biggest contribution you were able to make, do you think, in your time as the Lord Mayor?
Oh, look, I think it was on public transport and on the road network. So in a 7-year period, we bought about 700 new buses, which was very significant compared to what had happened in the past. We also, of course, built the Clem 7 tunnel, the go-between bridge, the Eleanor Chanel bridge to the university, the Green Bridge, and also put almost $1 billion into the suburban and arterial road network. So, dealing with traffic congestion was a big part of my agenda. There's still a whole lot that's still being undertaken. Projects like Airport Link that are being built, and also now the Legacy Way tunnel that's just kicked off. So, I might have left, but the things that we kicked off are still going on.
Tell me about growing up. A political family. You were born in Tasmania, I understand, but you actually grew up in Canberra, is that right?
No, not quite actually.
Okay.
I was born in Canberra.
Okay.
My dad was in the army, so he came from Sydney. My mum came from Melbourne, and so as a sort of an army brat, we moved all around Australia. And what happened in the early 70s, mum and dad decided to have a sort of I suppose it was a tree change or a Tasmanian change. So they moved down to Tasmania, and we actually had a farm down there for quite a few years. And at about the same time, my dad got into politics in the federal sphere.
Interesting growing up as a child with a parent in the army. You live all around Australia, travel overseas?
Yeah, well, we lived in Canberra a few times. We lived in Melbourne, we lived in Sydney. We lived in Brisbane in the 1960s at Everton Park, Tasmania, I mentioned before. Also lived in England for 2.5 years, the end of the 60s, early 70s. So certainly very interesting. The downside was being sort of ripped out of school every couple of years and going somewhere else, having to start again and leaving behind friends. So quite tricky.
What was your perception of politics as a child growing up with parents in the political arena?
Very exciting, I suppose, a real buzz around the house. But I think the big thing is that seeing that you can make a difference, seeing that my parents actually, through their involvement, are actually shaping the direction of the country and making a real difference to people's lives. For example, my father was a key person as the Federal Environment Minister in saving Fraser Island from sand mining.
Okay.
So Dad actually was the guy who went to Malcolm Fraser and said, look, we ought to save the island, stop the mining. I believe we can do it by not granting export permits for the minerals that would come out of it. And he said, okay, Kevin, will you go and tell Joe? So Dad had to come up to Brisbane with one of the other ministers, Peter Nixon, I think it was, and have a meeting with Joe and Russ Hinds. And it's a pretty torrid and difficult meeting.
I can imagine.
But had to tell them the good news that they weren't going to be allowed to mine the island.
Does having that family background drive your contribution to politics? Is it part of the Newman family legacy, perhaps?
Oh, not really, no. I mean, I'm my own man and I've had a different path. I might have been in the army the same as my father, but I went quite a different sort of route. I was an engineer. He was in the infantry corps. So engineering in the army is all about roads, bridges and airfields, and also some of the military engineering aspects as well. And I was then in business for 10 years in the grain industry. So I used to run the grain handling system in Queensland. So I had quite a long business career and I enjoyed business. So I might have ended up sort of being involved in state politics, but it was quite a different path.
An everyday childhood with parents in politics? I know we've got a couple of pictures of your parents living in Canberra there. Was it what you'd describe as a normal childhood? Your parents around a lot, or were they absent for for great periods of time? What was
No,
it
they
like
were
as a
around.
child?
They were around quite a lot,
Yeah.
which was good, and we were a very close family. I mean, the biggest sort of trauma, if you like, was when Dad went to Vietnam in 1967, 68, and I can't really remember that well, but you know, because I would have been about 4 going on 5.
Yeah.
But I do recall, like, Mum took us away from Everton Park and took us down to Melbourne so she could be near her mum, my grandmother, so she had that sort of support while Dad was overseas. So that was a difficult time for my mum and Dad.
My experience of that, and I think we have a pretty similar experience, is at about that same age of my father coming back from Vietnam for leave and going, who's this strange man all of a sudden come back into my life. It was an interesting and hard time for my mother and my family, I believe, but a lot of positives have come out of that. Was it a similar sort of experience for you?
Not so much for me. I think I knew my father well enough when he went away, so it was great to have him back. But my sister was very much like that. So she's 2 years younger. So she objected to this foreign bloke coming back into the house. Like, who's this man? We still laugh about it in the family.
Yeah.
That's what she said to Dad. And Dad to Mum. Who is he? Sort of thing.
Yeah. So, growing up, parents in politics, leaving school and choosing the army, was that a natural progression at that stage? I mean, it's interesting because you seem to have followed a similar path from your parents in a lot of ways.
Well, it really surprised my parents. What happened was my dad was involved in federal politics at the time. It was my final year of school. I'd already decided I wanted to do engineering, and I happened to be sitting there on the first day of the school holidays, as I recall, and there was the Bulletin magazine, and there was just an ad for the army, and I saw you could do engineering and saw you could be paid to do the degree. And I thought, oh, that looks pretty good. So I, without telling anybody, trotted down to the recruiting depot in Launceston, Northern Tasmania, got the paperwork, and then proceeded to present it to my parents a few days later and say, look, I want to give this a go. And they were very excited and happy about that, but it was quite a surprise to them because they'd never really spoken about it to me.
Was it an enjoyable experience for you? It can be an up and down life being in the army.
Look, I really enjoyed the army. I think it's just a great start in life. I think it's very much a young person's thing, but there's just such a variety of things that you do. You get to obviously be challenged. Like, I've done, for example, a couple of parachute jumps in my time. I don't ever want to do them again. It's terrifying, but I've done them. Always when I've got to confront something in politics that's a bit difficult, like standing in front of an angry crowd, for example. I often remember having to jump out of the back of a plane. I think if I could do that, I can go and do this meeting. It's much easier. But yeah, it was challenging. It was exciting. You got to see a whole lot of Queensland and Australia. Go to some very interesting places. Went overseas as well with the army, and I'd do it all again.
Okay, all right. You're watching Meet the Ministers. My guest on the program this evening is Campbell Newman, and we'll be back after the break.